Another is support for dictatorships and extremism. And we don't need to name countries. We just know that how many regimes have been overthrown, coup d'etat, how many regimes are being supported, and we would say on paper they should be boycotted, but then other regimes are boycotted, and so this is incompatible with any notion of functioning democracy. Another is that there is a lot of citizen engagement or disengagement, and often the best forms of citizen engagement are discredited and devalued and not considered. And then lastly, social inequalities. With so many people living on the streets, indigenous peoples losing their languages, cultures, with racism, how do we reconcile, how do elections eliminate poverty? And on the contrary, we might argue. So you might be asking, ooh, he's a little harsh. I want to say, I do vote. I do vote, and I think we all do, but I think we want something better, and we have to create that. Global citizenship, we're talking about solidarity, engagement, agency, global interconnections, there's global problems, and I think it's incontrovertible. We have to reconcile there are global problems. We live together on the planet, and if we don't, we'll be stuck in nationalist paradigms that will be very nefarious for us. And here's a very brief kind of sketch of some of the literature on global citizenship. And we have experts on global citizenship, so I can be corrected. I don't have the last word. But I think we have to think about the notion of dialogue being essential. We have to also consider knowledge, skills, values, attitudes of learners, socio-emotional, cognitive, behavioral levels, the importance of decolonial approaches, and then critical links to education and so on. And then transformative education, we have to think about education for social justice, but not just for, about, with, in relation to. We have to think about informal, formal, and non-formal relationships, and think about social relations as in relation to transformative possibilities. I'm not seeing, you're not seeing what I'm seeing. No? How do I go back? Okay. Yeah. So this small little model is something that Jean and I put together. It's one way of thinking about democracy in schools, and there's many ways, but this is one way. But if we were to say, did you here have a democratic education when you went to school? And if so, how would you define it? And so one of the ways that we think about it is to look at democracy in schools at many different levels: pedagogy, curriculum, educational policy, institutional culture, leadership, epistemology, and informal educational experience, and to try to break that down further. So what is the nexus? What is the center of all this that I'm trying to put together? And I think it's dialogue. And it's not just fanciful dialogue and opinions that we throw out, but it's dialogue with humility, with respect, in relation to power relations, and that critiques and problematizes hegemony. How do you do it? Okay, that's an issue that we have to consider, but I think that it's the antithesis of killing. Logic process involves a process. It's not an endpoint. It involves a context and deliberative forms. We can learn to engage in deliberative democracy in schools. This is something we can learn. We can learn to debate and to problematize and to question, but respectfully. And it has to be generally facilitated, and there's predispositions we have to consider. And so we're thinking about the engagement of this whole process of dialogue. So I want to move into peace now. And what is it? What is peace? And there are many dimensions: political, economic, cultural, social, environmental, gender, racial, interfaith peace. And I think Eisenhower spoke about the military-industrial complex. There are some people benefiting from these wars. We know that people going to fight these wars, for the most part, don't know the other people and don't necessarily have anything against them. But is peace the absence of conflict and violence? Is it nation state, grassroots? Is it cultural, social? Who decides about the peace? Is it explicit, implicit, and so on? And the decision making, who is fighting for peace? Why is peace education so difficult to cultivate? And why is violence so accepted around the world? That's Albert Einstein said, peace cannot be kept by force, it can only be achieved by understanding. And so I think the good news is that there are a lot of people fighting for peace, and there are peace education institutes, initiatives, groups, education, but it's not enough, but it is necessary, and there are a lot of organizations doing a lot of excellent work. What about bullying? Is there bullying in South Korea? Does it exist? Yeah. And it exists everywhere around the world. And we can think, wow, bullying came about through cyberbullying. Well, the cyberbullying is important and it has changed things, but it didn't create bullying. To have bullying, you have to have a context where people want and engage and it's tolerated and so on. But 1/3 of youth globally experience bullying in school. And there's other indicators here. What about women? And I want to come back to that because I think that without women being involved in the peace equation, I think men will be destined to continue to discuss the militarization and strategies and warfare techniques. And does this mean that women are better? No, it means that women have to be considered fully, and they have participated fully in various international movements. But we also have an epidemic against women, femicide, or here the statistic is that 137 women are killed every day around the world by a family member. Now, we can only speculate that these statistics are highly under-researched, that it's probably 10 times more than that, but these are official statistics. There's also women who are killed every hour by men around the world. And so violence against women is a serious issue. It's incompatible with democracy, it's incompatible with peace. And I think when we think about peace in the Middle East, peace anywhere, we have to think about this important issue as well. Police brutality. Does this exist in South Korea, or is it, no? Not so much, no. But it's more, this is an issue around the world, and I remember asking someone I met in Brazil, Afro-Brazilian, is there any police brutality in Brazil? And we didn't really speak the same language, but he started punching like this, so I thought he must be indicating there was. In relation to armaments and wars and conflicts, there's the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, which is really tremendous to document all of this. And there's also many databases that document nonviolent movements, but also violent movements throughout the world. I'll just go quickly because of the time. Why do we have so much arms? Why is the United States spending so much, $1 trillion a year on armaments, 800 military bases, and other countries too? It just does not make sense that so much capital limited is being spent on this. The number of people killed in conflicts around the world, outside of the couple of conflicts that are highlighted significantly. These are peace programs in Africa, and it shows that because of the weak democratic systems and governance, it's very difficult to keep the peace. There's a global peace index, and many countries around the world are mired in constant conflict. The non-green countries are where there is significant conflict around the world. So I'll be happy to share this, but I'm just, because of the time. These are peacemaking funding and the dynamics of peace and how organized violence takes place in and through the state, around the state, on the margins, and through armaments. We can see that many countries in Africa and Latin America, in Asia, Myanmar, there's armed struggles that have been going on for so long that they're not even really documented. Social media can play a role in interconnecting with people, collecting data. patriarchal dynamics in youth movements can create cyclical exclusionary norms if not addressed intentionally. And there's some very interesting quotes here from the study that I presented there a second ago. So what can we do? And I think I'd like to say we and me and you and everyone, what can we do? There's no easy solution. How do we change democracy? How do we make it democratic? How do we change education? How do we make it democratic and peaceful? And how do we change human rights? We know one thing for sure, is that killing one another is not the solution. It doesn't work. We also know that continuous debilitating exclusion, marginalization, discrimination, and hatred will not allow us to live in peace. So we need to have individual and collective emancipation and conscientization and solidarity. So what can we do? These are some thoughts that I'm throwing out, but there are many others, and I could be off track. But I think the UN Security Council, why are there 5 permanent members? This does not make sense in 2023. Why do we use testing to measure educational attainment when we know that it does not increase social justice and inclusion? What is the point of normative democratic elections when critically engaged democracy is not the main consideration? The main consideration is to get elected. Why do we have offshore tax shelters for the ultra wealthy so they do not pay tax into the societies where they are intended to cultivate meaningful existence? What will it take to address environmental catastrophe? John Bellamy Foster from Monthly Review uses that terminology, and I like that. And why do we still use war and conflict knowing that innocent people will be killed? And those charged with the killing have little or no interest and reason to do so. So how do we teach about power relations? And I think we have to teach about power relations. And where will we cultivate dialogue? I'll just briefly state, because of the time, but Jean and I put together these models of democratic education. And we want to think about democracy, and we can replace democracy with peace or citizenship, but think about education about democracy, through democracy, in relation to democracy, and for democracy in a very thick way. And we can think about this in a very expansive way, and I'll be happy to share a bit more with this. But we really have to think about reconfiguring our education for peace, I believe. There are democratic schools and models where we can try to be more democratic. We can't have autocratic democratic education systems thinking that they will produce democracy. Peaceful process around the world. Is it naive? This is important. People can come together, they can create solidarity, they can influence. If everyone in every army of the world said, no, I'm not going to do it, well, we wouldn't have armies invading. It's a complex notion, but there's a potential for people to rise up through conscientization. And so there's been many movements around the world that have effectively immobilized autocratic regimes. And there's nonviolent movements and so on. We can see around the world that there are ways of bringing people together. And we can see there's also a lot of youth activism in relation to LGBTQ, race relations, all sorts of other projects. Social movements happen outside of the strictures of formal government. And we can see this with I Don't Know More, Black Lives Matter, environment, peace, and so on. And these have to be more considered during normative elections and normative democracy. And here's a format or a framework for peace that we have to consider in relation to humility, solidarity, and building peace. These are a few other ideas that we might think about: reimagining democracy, teaching for peace, ending the arms race, problematizing formal and informal support for brutality and repression, emphasizing humility in dialogues. No one person has all of the answers. cultivating dialogue, and dialogue is at the center, and I think the arts are too. We have to have more culture and arts infused in our society, nonviolence, intercultural relations, and supporting media literacy is fundamental. The last one is very gratuitous and fortuitous and free. We can give someone a hug, we can tell them we care, and we can be friendly with people. This is something that the world can do. And if we did this much more, I think we could have some form of engagement. It won't stop poverty, but... So I'll end with this. What do you think? I think that's where we want to go. Thank you so much.
예, 감사합니다. 그러면은 지금부터
Thank you so much.
한 12시 40분까지 저희가
And
폴카
until
교수님의 기조발제를
12:40,
중심으로 해서
So based upon his presentation, we are going to have a roundtable session.
So from now on, within the time that is allowed, we will discuss on the keynote address that was delivered by Professor Paul Carr. I would like to introduce myself. I am currently working for the Kyunghee University Humanities College and also at the Seoul National University, and Vice Center Head at the Asia City Society Center. To my right, I also have Mr. Utak Chung, who is the Korean head for the Global Partnership for Education and also a visiting professor at the Humanities College at Kyunghee University. Great to see you all. Please introduce yourself briefly. Thank you. I am currently looking into two different subjects, also global community as well as SDGs. Before teaching, I was also at UNESCO for about 35 years. So in fact, I believe that my identity is closer to UNESCO. And like Professor Paul Carr, when I was in charge of the Asia Pacific Education Center, I think it was maybe 2007. I think it was, I met him during a symposium back in the days. I had all of our pamphlets and brochures, and on the last day, just before wrapping up, usually you actually just throw away all of the pamphlets or organize them. But Professor Paul Carr said, "What are you doing? Why are you throwing them away? I'm going to take all of them from you." So I was quite shocked and surprised. And he took all of those from me, and even all of the banners at the time. And he was completely caring for the Earth environment, and I was blown away even at the time. I think it was in 2018, and he was a lecturer, a special lecturer at the Asia Pacific Education Center to deliver a lecture on transformative education for democracy, and it was a big hit. And I think that he still has a lot of contact with a social media network with some of the students he met at the time. So he's actually leading by example. So thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to see you. So I'm sure that while you're listening, you realize why we have brought in Mr. Chung as the discussant. So Professor Paul Carr had delivered a great keynote address talking about the role of global citizen and university in the era of the Fourth Industrial Revolution and climate change. I think that this is a common foundational theme for our entire symposium. I don't think that for the sake of time, we need to go over the entire summary, but Mr. Chung, I think you can deliver some of your thoughts and your 2 cents on the theme, and maybe deliver a question or so to start off the discussion. So I am well aware that Professor Paul Carr has been very active in this field. So maybe a little bit embarrassing for me, but I did not really know what DCMÉT actually denotes. So in French, it was about democracy, and then citoyen mondial. So that was actually, and then it's also about transformative education. So it was actually all of the key words that we are talking about today. And it's bringing together all of the academics in the field of democracy, global citizenship, and transformative education. And I think that it's a very close connection to what I am doing. I'm also teaching about global citizenship, democracy, and transformative education, as well as the SDGs. So maybe the actual language that I speak of, it may be a little bit different, but the essence of it is very much akin to each other. So I think that going beyond time and space and coming together, I think we have been doing a lot of the similar work. So I am very much happy to be here to discuss together. I think that a lot of participants are coming together in North and South Americas, but I also want a lot of the Asia Pacific to participate. But then at one point, I think that there's a lot of concrete examples that we are already pursuing here. For example, in terms of education, we actually go to the site and we pursue a lot of activities for social justice, for injustice as well. And even at Kyung University, I talk a lot about global citizenship and those projects. I think that a lot of the things that I was doing was in line with your work. And now for a question, there is $1 million question for that DCMÉT, that D, democracy. This is actually your book, and I actually read through it from cover to cover. From what I got as a reflection is that over 90% of the content is talking about humans, democracy, and the overall society. The seriousness, I completely agree. And then the overall democracy factors and the climate change and climate crisis. I think one of the key problems is that everything is based off of humans because humans are the priority number one. Everything was created by humans. All other kinds of eco-diversity and other biodiversity has been pushed aside. In democracy, there's also thin democracy and thick democracy. And in that aspect, if we categorize those two democracies, can we actually address the climate issue? And can you give me an answer to that question?
Yes, thank you so much, Utak. And I want to say it's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you, and we're overwhelmed with sympathy and thoughts, because it really is a pleasure. So thank you. And I think that Songwon and Newtek probably know the book better than I do at this point, but I'm very pleased that you've engaged with it. I think that with thin democracy, and however we look at it, thin, I think being the elections and the winner-take-all governments that then try to get elected. The goal of a normative democracy is not democracy, it's to get elected. So I think that the education system, and we've heard yesterday in the last few days that certain measures have been made. I asked just, naively about research and so on. And governments make decisions that can have effects on people. I think we agree with that. But I think thin democracy, democracy that I kind of pointed out here, some of the normative electoral representative hegemonic democracy, will push us further away from human and species survival. So I think that it's clear that we're on a track right now for human extinction, species extinction, and also cultural extinction. When I say cultural extinction, I mean indigenous languages, indigenous cultures, practices, and so on. Will thick democracy help us as human beings? And I think this is a process, so there's no endpoint. But I think the notion of democracy, it should be open-ended. And we should really start to reconcile. If we have 5 generations of students, families that drop out of school, we can't continue to say, oh, well, that's just the way it is. And if we have women who are being violated and we have warfare. So the question is, how do we build and cultivate this democracy? And one of the issues I think we have in our collective societies is that we accept too willingly and too freely that we live in democracy. And I'm not sure about that. But we have endless potential, because when we're born, we're not born as racists or sexist, but we're also not born as Democrats. We're just born. So we have to cultivate democracy. The good news is that there are many issues and many people and many movements around the world doing that. But we don't necessarily see it in the formal spheres. They're not necessarily have power relations. And I always like to ask other people, and we may not have the time, but if we were in a class, I would ask, what do you think, and how do you think that we're going to get there, and what can we do? So we have to break down this formal notion that we live in a democracy because we have the elections and they decide, and then we are stuck with it. Because when we see people living on the streets, it doesn't really matter who voted. And the concern is that it goes on for many cycles. But also I hope this doesn't appear to be too much in pie in the sky, but I do believe in academic engagement, thoughts, processes, arguments, dialogues, and also civil society engagement. And this symposium also tries to bring together that we don't want to just be debating, but interacting. The issue that we have is also, where does government come in? And it's hard to bring government in, although there are people who want to do good things and many good people. So education really in our DCMÉT, it's very tough for us to conceptualize meaningful, vast social change without transformative education. And we rely in the book a lot on Paulo Freire, critical pedagogy, and there's many examples. Thank you.
예, 감사합니다. 사실 환경과 민주주의 문제.
So thank you very much. It's not just about environment and democracy, but also about education. So I'd like to ask you a common question. I think it's a very important question for Korea. Recently, there's a lot of talk about how public education has been disrupted, especially with rote learning, as well as the education system to get into colleges. A lot of the teachers have been committing suicide because they have been pressured by parents. The government has been pursuing a lot of change. And a lot of the teachers also are trying to raise empowerment for teachers as well. However, the problem is a lot of the teachers and parents, the relationship between them is that once neoliberalism had started, the people who started to get the education were these teachers and parents. And that's why not only the students, but also the parents and the teachers themselves were taught the principles of neoliberalism, and they were taught in the essence of being efficient and competitiveness. And so they were not so accustomed to democracy or this new kind of paradigm. So Professor Paul Carr talks about whether democracy is embedded in education nowadays. We actually need to think about, we need to be taught whether there was peace in it. We have to tell them, don't use violence. We have to think about whether we were actually taught about peace or not before we tell them not to use violence. So the parents and the teachers actually were taught about competition and violence because they had to step ahead of the other person. That's why all of these problems are surfacing in the first place. This kind of hegemony and ideology is being inflicted upon the current generation. So in that aspect, we need to disrupt this. And where can we find the possibility of completely coming anew from this kind of environment when we are embedded with these thoughts?
So much, Sangwon. Very sorry to hear. I wasn't aware that suicide and other issues of that extent, but I think that shows the gravity that a fuller analysis has to be made. What is the purpose of education? Is it to make sure that people are killed and suicides, or is it to build a society? Is it to get a job? If it's to get a job, then we know that we are immediately marginalizing 50, 60, 70% of the society who will not be partaking in perhaps that job sector. This is a problem around the world. And it's not just in South Korea. And I think this is one of the messages that I would give to myself, is that we need more engagement. We have to learn more about people. We have to be open to people's lived experiences. I think if education is not embedded, John Dewey talked about the lived experience and community, and Paulo Freire talked about the connection between different social classes and oppressed peoples. If education is not about some sense of emancipation, then what is it about? Creating conformity, people to accept inequities. Why are the education systems in all of these so-called developed countries, industrialized countries, controlled by visions of society that do not wish to include and focus on social justice? That would be the question. So obviously, normative elections do not preoccupy themselves with education and social justice. And I think that's a very important critical point, that we won't make it to where we want to go through that type of normative democracy we have created. So how do we get there? And there are many people, I always ask my students, who knows anyone who has dropped out? And everyone does. And how many people believe that those people are idiots, imbeciles? Nobody. Nobody drops out for cognitive reasons, social reasons, marginalization, bullying, low expectations from teachers being pushed out, and so on. So we have to really think about what education is for. And I wouldn't suggest eliminating education. We need education because it's too important for the fiber of society. But we have to really consider, why do we not focus on peace and social justice and citizenship and engagement? Testing and OECD and these other rankings, what's it all about? People focus on Finland a lot, and when you talk to people in Finland, well, they start school later, they pay their teachers better, they have more parental involvement, less focus on teaching, less disciplinary work. Okay, that's a very good model, and it works, and I don't disagree with it, but you can't just put it. So we have to really think about the conditions for teachers, salaries. We should consider many things. I'll throw out a few ideas. I did a book called Does Your Vote Count? Democracy and Critical Pedagogy, 2010, where I had about 100 proposals for education. And I'll just enumerate a couple. But one proposal is that here's a school in a wealthy neighborhood that does very well, high cultural capital, high parental support, and there are few social problems. Everyone goes to university. And here's a school 1 kilometer away where there are more social problems and more issues of poverty and maybe other social issues, and people don't do as well. Here's a proposal. This wealthy school does not graduate finished unless they help the other school graduate together. Make it a collective project. I know it won't work, but these are ideas. Another idea is the principals of schools should have 5-year contracts, and for you to continue in your contract, you have to show me each year what you're doing for social justice. Eliminate bullying, eliminate racism, eliminate sexism, increase engagement, and that should be as important as some of these other indicators. We should also consider giving small sabbaticals to teachers every few years so they can go and create educational projects. We should also bring civil society into schools, and we should also increase intercultural global engagement with people around the world, what you're doing in APSU and other places. So there are many things we can do, but I think the main thing is to consult with people, indigenous peoples, and see how would you like education to be concerned? What are your concerns and needs? And of course, we want to read and write and math and so on, STEM, but we also want to live in a society. So we have to decide how to do that. And I think that most people would want that. Why we don't do it, there's power considerations, and so we have to attack that. Thank you.
예, 정우택 선생님 말씀 드리기 전에 잠깐 정리를 드리면
So if I were to just wrap up and summarize, I think that there were a lot of concrete examples and great mentions. I think that it could be a very fundamental question, but in the early 2000s, even with education, it was more about a definition of the reproduction of labor that society needs. And the education itself was for freedom and for the well-being of others. And so it was actually building a person's capability. And so it's actually pursuing and creating a society. But actually, the education that we have actually learned has now become insignificant, and there's a lot of people who are just feeling unempowered. And so I think that relays to Mr. Utak Chung. I think that both of you have mentioned the crux of the problem. Personally, if I were to just mention, a lot of teachers have there were a lot of superior students who have become teachers. Even for the dean of the education school, also take a lot of time and effort to take the government test to become teachers. But they mentioned that realistically speaking, they face a lot of difficulties in the society, and so it becomes so challenging to become teachers and to work as teachers. That's why the government feels that we need to overhaul our society and regulations for teachers to support teachers. One of the solutions that is posed is that the society itself is actually based on a society of competition. So that puts a lot of pressure for parents as well as students alike. And just like Professor Paul Carr mentioned, we're actually going in the wrong direction because all over the world, the population is decreasing. And even with Korea, we're facing dire consequences, maybe with just one child or even no children at all. And in order to break that vicious cycle, we actually need to teach parents for maybe lifelong education. It could be a cliche, but I think we really need to teach parents on overhauling their perceptions. And recently, I've been talking a lot with these lifelong education organizations. But without that, I think there's a void in the overall education curriculum. So I think Professor Paul Carr also talks about K-12 and public education, that we really need quality education from the get-go, from the start. But I also think that we need to overhaul adult education and lifelong education as well. That's also very important because they have been taught in the wrong way. And so there's a lot of households that teach racism without even thinking about it. And so that's why I think that transformative education and media literacy, that's some of the things that we have been talking about. Those are maybe things that are beyond the public education sphere. So I think that those are some things that we need to be teaching adults. Okay, thank you very much for your input. I think I would like to deep dive in terms of the question now. I was quite curious about this aspect. I actually translated that book from Professor Paul Carr, and I was quite curious about it. If you think about war, it's actually bringing the assets of our community that is needed in our community. It's not honestly cooperating within each other and producing it ourselves. It's actually bringing it from elsewhere. So it's actually exploiting it from someone else. The same for land and other kind of resources. That's why it's actually disrupting the livelihoods and the lives of others. And even with democracy, and if you think about the rule by people in democracy, the reason why we do that is because the policy for rule by people is actually using the principles of how to share and spread the common resources among the people within that community. So this actually evolves into the concept of the republic. So the same goes for war and democracy. It's actually about exploiting and taking from others and then sharing in an equal method amongst ourselves. But then when I read Professor Paul Carr's book, and we also talk about global citizenship education, we really think about we need to overhaul the legislation, the institutions. We have to resist against it, and we have to change our perceptions. However, I think that we lack in some aspect. We need something extra. We talk about the common goods and commons. How can we actually produce that common asset or common resources? So the indigenous people actually lived on their own. They could stand on their own feet without having to depend on the external factors or external people. They had their own welfare system to have their own common production system so that they had a common cooperative economy. And I thought that this was a very important factor. I thought that this is a very common element. I want to ask your opinion on this.
Yes, thank you, Utak and Songwon. I think that how do we consider indigenous peoples? And this is why I made a comment to open the symposium about living on unceded territory. What does that mean? It means that people like that took land, and what are the prices? What are the consequences? We live with that. We're very proud. We have the Canadian passport and so on. And we live with all of these paradoxes. And I want to give a small example when we think about education, transformed education. Who here believes that the United States 2003 invasion of Iraq was a very good idea? Okay, it looks like nobody supports that notion, but perhaps if you do, I don't know. But I think in 2003, very few people thought it was a good idea. I protested in Ottawa, and many people around the world protested. Why? Because most people around the world knew that Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, and that it could cause total disruption, and it caused 1 million deaths, it caused several million refugees, it created the Islamic State, it created 20 years of chaos. My point is, what happened to education? What did we do in education whereby this government in particular was able to say, we're going to go to war and we don't care? And people in general, not everyone, but did we learn in education to say, no, that's a lie. You're going to kill my sons, mainly. You're going to create havoc. We can't be xenophobic about people leaving their countries when we invade their countries to kill them. We can't kill people because they're not democratic. These are dialectical questions that should happen in and through education. And I'm wondering, and this is just a rhetorical question, if we taught more deliberative democracy, more meaningful, critically engaged social justice education in and through schools, would people then stand up and say, no, I'm not going to destroy our lives, our cultures, and other people? So I think that this is part of it, is that we're very timid in general to talk about these very issues. We think they're political: war, feminicide, poverty, racism. I teach anti-racism, and the reaction, some of the student evaluations are very harsh. Why is he calling me a racist? I'm not calling anyone a racist. How do you talk about this stuff? If you don't talk about it, we won't get to it. So we have to talk about this in and through education. And we have to open up the doors so that we can address meaningful issues. And so I think the curriculum has to be reconsidered, and we have to learn to debate. And I say that humbly. I'm not saying we're not doing this. There are a lot of well-meaning people in education who want to do this, but when we focus on the test scores, we then eliminate these other variables. Thank you.
예, 아무튼 전체적으로 좀 포괄적인 답변을 해주셨고요. 정우찬 선생님 말씀 좀 들어보겠습니다.
예.
So thank you for the comprehensive answer. And now Mr. Chung. So I think Mr. Lee talked about the commons, and I think that that's a great point that you have brought up. So we talk about the crisis of capitalism. I think that, yes, that's the only way out for us now. And I think there's no other answer. Maybe the cooperatives could be a viable solution. At the moment, I am teaching about the SDGs, but even with the SDGs, I think that it is an area that actually takes into account commons, because we talk about poverty, famine, equality, sanitation, education, water, energy, and all climate, marine resources, as well as everything related. That is regarding the entire commons of the Earth, and I guess that's the UN SDGs. Of course, there could be other examples too, but actually, as for now, it's actually talking about the SDGs and learning about the SDGs, really understanding, inheriting the SDGs, and that's actually the way to go to the global commons. And within that line of thought, I think that maybe it's a mechanism of getting to that. And Professor Paul Carr mentioned the 2003 US invasion of Iraq. And at the time, we kind of just laid back and watched, I think. And now, in hindsight, we kind of think about why did we do that at the time? And at the time, I think that when we talked about wars in other countries, there wasn't certain responses. But Professor Paul Carr's PowerPoint also talked about nuclear weapons and how many there were, and there's about 12,000 on this world. But think about it. Imagine what happens. Something completely comes right next to us. It becomes something that's something right in our neighborhood. If a political leader that has no relation to me whatsoever presses a button to set off a nuclear bomb, then what do you think will happen? It's going to be mesmerizing and, I mean, completely blowing your mind, because it's going to be an issue with global peace. It's going to be a very serious issue. So I believe that we really need to talk about things that can come close to heart. We need to think about issues for elementary, middle school, and high school, and really honing in to the aspects that touch on the greed of humans. It's not watching from at bay what happens across the river. It's really something that's in your neighborhood. Okay, thank you very much for your input. And now this is my last question. This could be a sensitive issue, or it could be an easy question for you. So yesterday in a different session, we talked about, I won't mention the person, but they talked about how democracy education and global citizenship education is actually something that should be discussed in our daily lives, something that should be actively discussed in our daily lives. So that kind of stayed with me. Professor Paul Carr talked about the Iraq War. That's actually 20 years ago, if you think about it, if you count back. So if we are going to be talking about that in our classrooms, all right, so let's say we talk about the Israel and Palestinian war. Can we actually talk about it in a lateral method and in a democratic method in our classrooms? Of course, if we talk about the past, yes, of course, we can reflect on it. But I think that if we talk about democracy, we have to talk about issues that are really close to heart, something that are very sensitive, that we can't really discriminate, or that we can't really set apart from being subjective about it. I think that we need to be talking about the sensitive issues on how we can approach them in a smart and in a smart way, in a wise way. Mr. Tung first, maybe. I think that that's a very important issue. We talked about this at UNESCO, I think maybe in 2015 or so, or 2013. I think that it was a global citizenship education in Paris. And he said, it's not a true a global democratic citizenship education unless you talk about the very sensitive ideas. So the problem is, if we actually talk about it in the classroom, it's a fickle issue because it's very regulated and there's a lot of limitations. So I, for myself, I think I have lots of limitations myself as well. Even in Korea, a lot of teachers haven't been trained enough for those situations. They go through the government tests and exams, and then they become teachers. But it's very difficult for them to talk about these very sensitive issues after having just taken the standardized tests. So in not just the overall standardized tests, but I think that we also need to be talking about this in the global citizenship education, the democratic citizenship education, environment education. And if you look at the curriculum, it's all about standardized education and training. It's all about how to teach well. But I think that we do need to think about critical thinking, critical teaching as well. So even at my Asia Pacific Education Center, we are looking into it, but because of budget restraints, we are limited in some aspects. We are taking baby steps in expanding it. Even a few days ago, I was in Yeosu, down south, and we talked about how to train teachers better for global citizenship education. So I am spreading the word, but if you speak in relative terms on the number of teachers in Korea compared to the overall number of teachers all around the world, then you hit a wall all the time.
Thank you so much for the dialogue. And I feel very strongly about this point, is that to avoid sensitive issues with children and students who live in reality is to tell them that we don't care about racism and poverty and anything, war. So the question isn't, should we do it? We have to do it. There is no other option. How do we do it? And I think there is resistance amongst parents and teachers and so on, because often there is the impression that it's a binary proposition, for or against same-sex marriage, for or against the death penalty, for or against war. It's not. Any of those issues has a million dimensions, and we have to open up the door so that we can cultivate understanding. There's no finite one answer to femicide. Why do men kill women? Well, we're against it, but what do we do? So we have to be able to listen, actively listen, and we have to cultivate debate, but we also have to think about research and reason and experience. All of these things can be cultivated. And if we don't do it, I think we're destined to have, I used Iraq 20 years ago. I'll tell you, when I did my undergraduate studies in political science, literally a century ago, most of my professors in Toronto were American. And why? They came to Canada to avoid the Vietnam War, which ended in 1975. And before that, there was the Korean War. And before that, so we can continue on this road, but what I think is most distressing is that the people who are benefiting from these standardized tests and hegemonic education, hegemonic elections, are not the ones doing the hand-to-hand combat. And I think that would be the question we'd have to ask young people. What about you going to these wars? And what about you not having children who can go to university? And what about you living in poverty? And I would, this is, maybe it's radical because it isn't being done, but this is in my mind. I think we have to know, and I don't know, even in Canada, how much the Canadian government is investing in armaments, developing the arms, selling the arms, using the arms. We need to show this to young people and say, this is where your tax dollars go for your parents. You don't know anything about it. We sold $15 billion in armored tanks to Saudi Arabia a few years ago. We only find out later on. So the media, the normative corporate mainstream media is not very helpful. This is why the media literacy part comes into it. But we really have to reimagine education for people. And I just end that we live with a lot of paradoxes. What I mean is that we're here talking, and this is wonderful. We're thinking about the environment, and yet we have cars, probably. We like to go to restaurants. We like to have homes. We love people. We want to be in solidarity, and yet, so we live with these paradoxes. We critique democracy, yet we vote. I wrote down a few other things, but we have a lot of, so I think we have to accept we live with a lot of complexity, but with a lot of human agency, the capacity to have solidarity. It's more normal for us to be in solidarity with one another than to want to kill one another. To want to kill one another, I have to really go through a programming phase in my mind to vilify you. And most of these combatants in any war anywhere, they don't really have much against the other person they're trying to kill. In fact, they have a lot in common. So I think that education is really pivotal, a key piece to the democracy piece, the civil society, and we have to really be concerned about human existence. And I humbly say, and I'm not an expert and so on, but in relation to indigenous peoples, we have to listen. Because what have we done? We've destroyed cultures and spiritual systems and so on, and yet they have sustained themselves in many ways through the environment, despite the cultural genocide. So we have to be much more humble about this, and I think education needs to be much more humble. And when I say that, we have to say, not that the Minister of Education has the answer, and here's the funds, and here's the testing, and here's the scores, and here's the ranking, but we have to say, what do we want for education for everyone? And I think this is a quest that we need in all societies. It's not only here, but I very much appreciate your comments, because it sounds like there's a lot of duress and stress, and if it continues, it's very dire for many people. So thank you so much.
예, 너무 좋은 말씀 감사드립니다. 짧게 우리 정찬 선생님 정리 발언 마무리 한번 해주시죠.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chung. Just a brief comment, please. Well, thank you for inviting me to this great discussion. I think that it's an honor to discuss with Professor Paul Carr. I think that this book itself should be more widespread in Korea. And related to UNESCO-DCMÉT, I think that we really need more symposiums like this in Korea, because this is more about talking about how together we need to build a better future and a better world. It's not about instigating war, and it's more about let's build peace and let's build a better world together. So I think that we need to build better networks like this and expand this network into Korea and Asia. I just personally believe that these opportunities need to be expanded. I personally am very glad to have met Professor Paul Carr and also DCMÉT. I'm also happy that we are not alone in this fight together. So thank you. So thank you to Professor Paul Carr and Mr. Chung Woo-taek. Please give them a big round of applause, and we'll wrap up this discussion. Thank you.